The auctioneer's voice, a rhythmic, hypnotic chant, cut through the crisp October air of 1972. It was the sound of fortunes changing hands, of legacies ending and ambitions beginning. For most of the farmers gathered in the muddy yard of the old Henderson place, it was a social event, a chance to kick tires and swap lies. For me, Frank Miller, it was a hunt. And for my neighbor, Richard Peterson, it was a victory lap. Rich stood near the front, chest puffed out in a new Carhartt jacket that hadn't seen a day of real work. He'd just bought the prime bottomland, another 200 acres added to his ever-expanding empire, all financed by a handshake and a smile from Mr. Abernathy at the Farmers' Trust. Now he was picking over the bones of the Henderson operation like a crow on a gut pile, buying up anything new enough to have a warranty. I stayed at the back, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of a worn denim jacket, the fabric softened by years of grease and sweat. My farm wasn't the biggest in the county, but every bolt, every acre, every shingle on the barn roof was mine. No bank man held a single slip of paper with my name on it. My father had taught me that debt was a chain, and I'd spent my life making sure I was the only man who held the key. "All right, boys, let's move on to the heavy iron," the auctioneer squawked, his voice cracking through the portable speaker system. "Lot number 73. What we got here is a real project for a fella with more time than sense." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd as they parted to reveal the beast. It sat slumped in the tall weeds behind the barn, a monument of faded yellow paint and rust. It was a big bud, an early model, an HN 320. The tires, nearly as tall as I was, were cracked and flat, sinking the massive axles deep into the soil. The articulated steering joint was frozen with rust, giving it a broken-backed look. One of the huge fenders was bent up like a dog's ear, and the glass in the cab was a spiderweb of cracks. It was a forgotten giant, a relic from a brief, optimistic time before the fuel prices started to climb. Rich Peterson let out a loud, theatrical laugh. "Look at that thing. Henderson must have been drunk when he bought it. Who in their right mind would try to farm with a road-building scraper?" More chuckles from the crowd. They saw what Rich saw, a pile of scrap. An expensive, oversized mistake. But I saw something else. I saw the frame, built from 1-inch thick steel plate. I saw the massive Clark planetary axles, the same kind they used in mining equipment. And through the grime and grease caked on the engine block, I could just make out the nameplate, Cummins. It was an NTC 855, a legendary engine, the heart of a million semi-trucks that hauled the nation's goods from coast to coast. That engine alone, if it could be saved, was a powerhouse. "What am I bid for this?" "This yard art," the auctioneer cajoled. "Let's start it at scrap price. $500. Do I hear 500? That's what the scrapper offered the widow this morning. $500 to haul it away." Silence. The scrapper's bid was the baseline. It was its official valuation as junk. $550, I said, my voice low but clear. Every head turned. Rich Peterson's smile faltered for a second, replaced by a look of pure disbelief. Then the smile returned, wider and more mocking. "Well, looky here," he boomed, making sure everyone could hear. "Frank Miller's going to build himself a new empire, an empire of rust. What are you going to do with that thing, Frank? Plant it in the front yard for the kids to climb on?" My jaw tightened, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reply. I just kept my eyes on the auctioneer. "I got $550 from Mr. Miller. Do I hear $600? One of Rich's buddies, goaded by a nudge, yelled, "600. $650, I said immediately, without hesitation. Rich shook his head, a look of pity on his face. He was performing for the crowd now. "Frank, take some friendly advice. That thing will cost you $10,000 just to get it running, and it'll still be a piece of junk. For that kind of money, you could put a down payment on a brand new John Deere 4630. Air conditioning, a radio, the works." He had just bought one, of course. A gleaming green machine with jewels, a sound guard cab, and a payment book as thick as a Bible. "I don't like payment books," I said, loud enough for him to hear. $700, his friend called out. $750, I countered. The bidding went on like that, me against Rich's proxy, in $50 increments. It was a game to him, a way to make me look like a fool and drive up the price on a piece of scrap. The crowd watched, murmuring. They were all caught up in the new way of thinking. Bigger, newer, faster. Leverage your assets, the farm magazine said. Use the bank's money to make money. It sounded good on paper, but I'd seen what happened in the 30s when the paper came due and the rain didn't fall. My father's stories were etched into me like brand marks. We reached $1,000. The auctioneer, smelling blood, was getting excited. $1,000? Now we're talking. Do I hear 1,100? Rich held up a hand to stop his friend. He walked over to me, his boots making sucking sounds in the mud. He lowered his voice, putting on a show of neighborly concern. Frank, seriously, stop. You're throwing good money away. The block is probably cracked. The transmission's likely shot. You're buying a 20-ton paperweight. That's my business, Rich, I said, meeting his gaze. He sighed, shaking his head as if I were a lost cause. Fine, it's your funeral. He turned to the auctioneer. Let him have it. I wouldn't give $1 more for that heap. Sold, the auctioneer bellowed, slamming his hand down. For $1,000 to Frank Miller. Son, you just bought yourself a whole lot of tractor. A few people clapped, but it felt more sarcastic than celebratory. As I walked to the clerk's trailer to pay my $1,000 in cash, I could hear Rich holding court. Poor old Frank. Stuck in his daddy's ways. While the rest of us are moving into the future, he's buying museum pieces. He'll be broke in 5 years, mark my words. I ignored them. I had work to do. Now, before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you something. It's about a choice. The choice between the old way and the new way. Have you ever had to make a decision like that in your own life? To stick with something tried and true, something you owned free and clear, even when everyone around you was chasing the latest, shiniest thing on credit? Let me know in the comments below. I'm curious to hear if this kind of thinking still exists in the world. Getting the big bud home was the first battle. It was 12 miles from the Henderson place to my farm, and the machine was dead weight. I hired a heavy-haul trucking company from the city, the only ones with a lowboy trailer big enough to handle the tractor's 20-foot length and 20-ton bulk. The cost of that transport alone was nearly half what I'd paid for the tractor, a fact that didn't go unnoticed by the gossips down at the grain co-op. The day it arrived, it felt like the whole county turned out to watch. They lined the road as the semi groaned its way up my lane. Rich Peterson was there, leaning against the fence of his new field across the road, arms crossed, a smug look on his face. He'd made a special trip just for the spectacle. The trucker, a big man with a greasy cap, looked at the tractor, then at my barn, then back at the tractor. "Where you want this thing, mister? It ain't gonna fit in your shed." He was right. My machine shed, which comfortably housed my John Deere 4020 and my old Farmall Super M, looked like a dollhouse next to the big bud. "Just put it there," I said, pointing to a level patch of ground between the shed and the workshop, right on the gravel. It took them an hour of winching and groaning, the lowboy trailer creaking in protest, to get the giant tractor onto my property. When it was finally settled, it just sat there, dominating the farmstead. It looked even worse up close. The paint was peeling in sheets, revealing pitted steel underneath. The hydraulic lines were cracked and weeping a black sticky fluid. The cab smelled of mouse nests and mildew. It was Miller's Folly, just as they were already calling it at the coffee shop. My wife, Martha, came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the tractor, then at me. She didn't say a word, but her eyes asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "What have you done?" "It's got good bones, Martha," I said, more to myself than to her. "The engine is sound. I can feel it." That winter was a long one. While Rich Peterson was down in Florida with his family, his new equipment sitting clean and safe in his brand-new bank-funded Morton building, I was outside in the biting Dakota wind, waging a war against rust and neglect. I started with the engine. The Cummins NTC 855 was an inline-six, a monster of an engine displacing 855 cubic inches. Just getting to it was a chore. The hood panels were so heavy I had to lift them off with the chain hoist on my old A-frame. The first thing I did was drain the oil. What came out wasn't oil. It was a thick, black sludge, the consistency of molasses, full of water and grit. A bad sign. I pulled the valve covers, more sludge. It was clear the machine had been sitting for years, collecting condensation. For a month, I did nothing but tear it down. Every bolt was a fight. I soaked them in penetrating oil, heated them with an acetylene torch until they glowed red, and then leaned on them with a 4-foot breaker bar until they either broke loose with a gunshot crack or snapped off, forcing me to drill them out and re-tap the holes. My knuckles were perpetually bruised and bleeding. The smell of rust and old diesel was ground into my skin. The cylinder head was so heavy it took me and my teenage son, David, both straining on the chain hoist to lift it free of the block. When we got it off, my heart sank. The cylinder walls were streaked with rust. Piston number 4 was seized solid. Water had leaked in through a bad exhaust gasket and sat there for years, welding the piston to the cylinder sleeve. "It's junk, Dad," David said, his breath fogging in the cold air. Peterson was right. "No," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "It's just a problem, and every problem has a solution. Hand me that block of wood and the big hammer." For 2 days, I worked to free that piston. I filled the cylinder with diesel fuel, then with Marvel Mystery Oil, letting it soak. I heated the outside of the block with the torch, trying to expand the sleeve. I hammered on the oak block placed on top of the piston, the shocks vibrating through the whole engine. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, it broke free. The sleeve was scored and the piston was ruined, but the block itself seemed okay. Finding parts was the next ordeal. You couldn't just walk into the local implement dealer for Big Bud parts in 1972. They didn't exist. The company that built it, Northern Manufacturing out of Havre, Montana, had only been around a few years. But the Cummins engine was another story. I spent hours on the phone calling truck stops and salvage yards across the Midwest. I finally located a rebuild kit, new sleeves, pistons, rings and bearings, at a big truck depot in Omaha. I drove the 400 miles down there in my old Ford pickup to get it, the cost of the parts and the fuel eating up most of my savings from the fall harvest. The community watched my struggle with a mix of pity and amusement. Men would slow their trucks down as they passed my place, shaking their heads at the sight of the disassembled giant sitting in the snow. Rich Peterson would sometimes stop his brand-new Lincoln Continental at the end of my lane. He wouldn't get out. He'd just sit there for a minute, looking at my greasy, frustrating project, before driving off with that self-satisfied smirk on his face. He was the king of the county, and I was the court jester. By March, the engine was going back together. I honed the cylinders, plaster-gauged the new bearings, and torqued the head bolts in the precise sequence the Cummins manual demanded. I rebuilt the turbocharger on my workbench, cleaning every blade and checking the tolerances with a feeler gauge. I flushed the fuel system, rebuilt the massive PT fuel pump, and installed new injectors. Every step was slow, methodical, and done by the book. I was working more as a mechanic than a farmer, and the spring planting season was fast approaching. Martha was patient, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Frank," she said one night at the dinner table, "the 4020 needs a tune-up, and you haven't even looked at the planter yet. Are you sure you're not wasting your time on that thing?" "It'll be worth it," I promised her. "This tractor with no payment will give us an advantage. You'll see." Finally, the day came. It was a cool morning in early April. I had filled the radiator with fresh coolant and the crankcase with 30 quarts of new oil. The batteries, 4 of them, were fully charged. I climbed up into the cab, the cracked seat sighing under my weight. I turned the key. The gauges flickered to life. I pushed the starter button. The big starter motor engaged with a heavy clunk, and the massive engine began to turn over, slow and protesting. Whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. It sounded like a dying beast. I held the button down, feeding a little ether into the intake. It coughed, sending a puff of black smoke out of the straight pipe exhaust. I kept cranking. Whoomp, whoomp, whoomp chug. It fired on 1 cylinder, then 2. The whole tractor shuddered. I gave it a little more throttle. More smoke billowed out, thick and white at first, then turning grey, then finally black. And then it happened. The chugging smoothed out into a deep, rumbling idle, a powerful rhythmic thrumming that you felt in your chest more than you heard with your ears. The Cummins NTC 855 was alive. I sat there for a full minute, my hand trembling on the throttle, just listening to that beautiful sound. It was the sound of defiance. It was the sound of my $1,000, my winter of frozen fingers, and my stubborn pride roaring to life. The next few years were a blur of change. The early 70s brought a wave of prosperity to the American heartland like no one had ever seen. The Russians, facing a massive crop failure, started buying American grain in unprecedented amounts. The deal, which came to be known as the Great Grain Robbery, sent commodity prices soaring. Corn went from $1 a bushel to $3. Soybeans doubled, then tripled. Suddenly, there was money everywhere. For men like Rich Peterson, it was like pouring gasoline on a fire. With the banks practically begging farmers to take loans at low interest rates, he leveraged everything. He used his skyrocketing land values as collateral to buy more land, often paying prices that would have been unthinkable just a year before. He traded in his 2-year-old John Deere 4630 for a brand new 4840, and then bought a monstrous Steiger Panther to go with it. His fleet was the most modern, most powerful in the state. He built new grain bins, a new heated workshop, and a grand new house on a hill overlooking his fields. To everyone, he looked like a genius, a man perfectly in tune with the times. He was the face of modern, progressive agriculture. And me? I was still Frank Miller, the man with the big, ugly yellow tractor. The Big Bud, which I'd christened the Independence, proved to be an absolute beast. After rebuilding the engine, I'd spent the next summer going through the rest of it. I rebuilt the transmission, fabricating my own clutch plates. I replaced every cracked hydraulic hose, a job that took over 500 feet of new hose. I welded the cracked fender, pounded it back into shape, and replaced the broken glass in the cab. I gave it a new paint job, not the original yellow, but a deep, solid red, the color of our old farmall. It wasn't pretty, but it was sound. When the grain boom hit, I was ready. With the Big Bud pulling a 30-foot chisel plow, I could work ground faster than any 2-wheel drive tractor in the county. While my neighbors were making 2 or 3 passes, I was covering the acres, and every acre I worked was pure profit. I had no $3,000 a month payment to the bank. I had no interest charges eating away at my bottom line. My fuel costs were high, but the efficiency of covering so much ground so quickly made up for it. I didn't get rich like Peterson. I didn't buy new land. I didn't build a new house. I took the profits from those good years and I saved them. I paid cash to tile our wettest 80 acres, improving its drainage and yield. I replaced the roof on the barn. I started a college fund for David. I put the money in the bank, in simple savings accounts and certificates of deposit, where it sat, safe and steady. In the eyes of the community, I was a failure. They saw Rich Peterson's expanding operation and my static one, and they drew their own conclusions. They saw him pulling into town in his new Lincoln, and me in my 10-year-old Ford pickup. They saw his wife with new clothes and jewelry, and my Martha still canning vegetables from her garden. They mistook caution for cowardice and debt for prosperity. "You know, Frank," Peterson said to me one day at the co-op, "you're missing the boat. Land values are only going one way, up. You could take that old farm of yours, borrow against it, and double your operation. You're sitting on a gold mine and treating it like a vegetable patch." "I'm doing all right, Rich," I told him. "All right?" he scoffed, loud enough for others to hear. "Frank, this is the new age of farming. You got to get big or get out. A guy like you with your old-fashioned ideas, you're going to get left behind. You and that homemade tractor of yours." The men listening chuckled. They agreed with him. I was a relic, a stubborn old fool who couldn't see the golden opportunity right in front of him. I just nodded, paid for my seed corn with a check drawn on an account that had actual money in it, and walked away. But I was starting to see things they didn't. I listened to the news on the radio late at night. I read the financial pages of the newspaper from the city. I heard whispers of inflation getting out of control. I saw the price of fuel and fertilizer climbing steadily, far outpacing the price of grain. The Federal Reserve was making noise about raising interest rates to cool things down. For a man with no debt, rising interest rates were an inconvenience. For a man like Rich Peterson, who was leveraged to the hilt with variable rate loans, they would be a death sentence. The fall of 1979 was a wet one. The harvest was a miserable, muddy slog. I remember finishing my last field of soybeans, the Big Bud's huge tires paddling through the mud, pulling the combine without leaving ruts. That night, I sat in my worn armchair, listening to the president on the television. He was talking about a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. He was talking about sacrifice for a greater good. I turned off the television and looked out the window into the dark. The wind was howling, a cold, mournful sound. I could feel it in my bones, the same way an old man feels an approaching storm. The good times were over, the party was ending, and the bill was about to come due. And I knew that most of my neighbors, dazzled by the bright lights of borrowed prosperity, had no idea how to pay it. The grain embargo of '79 was like a door slamming shut. One day, the grain elevators were paying top dollar, their legs running day and night to fill ships bound for Russia. The next, the market vanished. Prices on the board at the co-op didn't just drop, they fell off a cliff. The hum of prosperity that had echoed across the plains for nearly a decade fell silent, replaced by a nervous quiet. That winter, for the first time in years, farmers weren't talking about buying new equipment. They were talking about how to make the payments on the equipment they already had. The spring of 1980 arrived with a brassy, cloudless sky. The sun beat down, and the wind, a hot, dry breath from the southwest, blew relentlessly. It picked up the topsoil from the fall-plowed fields and threw it against the houses and fence lines. The rain didn't come. April passed with only a few scattered showers. May was bone dry. The young corn plants, which should have been knee-high by Memorial Day, were spindly yellow things, their leaves curled tight like tiny cigars, trying to hold on to what little moisture they had. That was the year Rich Peterson's empire began to show its cracks. I saw him out in his field one morning, the one right across the road, standing beside his magnificent Steiger Panther. The tractor was silent, its huge duals sitting motionless in the dust. Rich was pacing back and forth, gesturing wildly. A service truck from the dealership was parked next to it, the mechanic leaning against the fender, shaking his head. I was cultivating my own corn that day with the old 4020, and on my next pass along the road, I saw the dealership truck drive away. Rich was still there, his hands on his hips, staring at the dead machine. I pulled my tractor to a stop and walked across the ditch. "Trouble, Rich?" I asked. He jumped, not having heard me approach over the wind. His face was pale under his tan, his eyes bloodshot. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a frantic energy. "It's the circuit board," he spat, kicking one of the giant tires. "The main controller for the transmission, it's fried. The mechanic says he's never seen one go like that. They don't have one in stock. Not in the state, not in the region. They have to order it from the factory, might be 2 weeks. 2 weeks. My corn is burning up out here, and this $500,000 piece of junk is a lawn ornament." I looked at the tractor. It was a marvel of modern engineering, with a cab full of switches, digital readouts, and blinking lights. And all of it was useless because of a piece of plastic and wire the size of a postcard. "That's tough luck," I said, and I meant it. "Tough luck?" he laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "It's a catastrophe. I've got another 600 acres of corn to cultivate, and then the soybeans. I'm already behind. Every day I wait, I'm losing bushels." He looked over at my 4020, chugging away faithfully in my field. Then his eyes drifted to my farmstead, where the Independence sat parked by the barn, its red paint dusty but solid. "I suppose your old relic is running just fine." "She runs," I said. "If a wire comes loose, I can trace it. If a switch goes bad, I can get a new one at the auto parts store. It's all simple." He just shook his head and walked away, pulling a phone book from his pickup to start calling for custom work. The cost of hiring someone else to do his field work, on top of the massive payment for the tractor that was sitting idle, was a double blow. A few weeks later, a for sale sign appeared on an 80-acre parcel at the far end of his property. It was a piece of marginal ground he'd paid a premium for back in '75. No one was buying. The sign just sat there, fading in the relentless sun, a quiet testament to a changing reality. The whispers at the co-op started to get louder. My big bud, the Independence, became my salvation that year. The drought tightened its grip through June and July. The corn tasseled when it was barely shoulder-high, but I had my secret weapon. Pulling a massive V-ripper, I was able to go deep into the subsoil, breaking up the hardpan that the drought had baked into concrete. It allowed the meager rains we did get to penetrate deeper to get to the roots. While my neighbor's fields were firing, the bottom leaves of the cornstalks turning a dead, crispy brown, mine stayed green a little longer. One evening, I was working late, the big Cummins engine pulling effortlessly, the roar a comforting presence in the twilight. I was running without lights, under a full moon. A hydraulic line on the V-ripper let go with a loud pop and a spray of hot oil. I shut everything down, climbed out of the cab, and inspected the damage. It was a standard half-inch hose. I unbolted it, threw it in the back of my pickup, and drove home. In my workshop, I had a roll of hydraulic hose and a crimping tool I'd bought years ago. Within an hour, I had a new hose made and was back in the field, working under the stars. I lost maybe 90 minutes of work. If that had happened to one of Peterson's machines, with its complex high-pressure systems and proprietary fittings, it would have been another call to the dealer, another day or two of downtime, another bill for hundreds of dollars. That year, I didn't have a bumper crop, nobody did. But I had a crop, and because I had no debt, every bushel I sold was mine. For Rich and so many others, most of their crop, what little there was, belonged to the bank before it was even out of the field. The harvest of 1980 wasn't just a harvest of corn and soybeans, it was a harvest of consequences. The final hammer blow fell in the winter of 1981. To combat the runaway inflation that had plagued the country, the Federal Reserve, under a man named Paul Volcker, raised interest rates to levels not seen in living memory. The prime rate, the number that governed all other loans, climbed to over 20%. For a man with savings, it was a good thing. The interest on my certificates of deposit suddenly looked very healthy. But for a farmer leveraged with variable rate loans, it was a death warrant. Rich Peterson's entire operation was built on a pyramid of debt, all of it tied to that prime rate. His operating loan for seed and fertilizer, the mortgages on the thousands of acres he'd bought, the financing on his fleet of new equipment, the interest on all of it tripled almost overnight. His monthly payments became astronomical, impossible figures that bore no relation to the price of corn. Mr. Abernathy, the friendly banker who had once clapped Rich on the back and called him the future of farming, was now a man under pressure from his corporate headquarters. The handshakes and smiles were gone, replaced by registered letters and stern phone calls. Farming had ceased to be about land and weather. It had become a brutal exercise in cash flow, and the cash was flowing in the wrong direction. The end came swiftly. First, the bank repossessed the equipment. I watched one morning as two semi-trucks from the dealership, the same ones that had delivered the shiny new machines with such fanfare, hauled them away. The Steiger Panther, the big John Deere 4840, the new combine. They were all gone, leaving empty spaces in his giant new shed like missing teeth. Then came the foreclosure notices on the land. The bank took it all, piece by piece, until all that was left was the original homestead, the 160 acres his grandfather had settled. And then they came for that too. An auction was scheduled for a cold, blustery day in March of 1982. It was held in the same muddy yard where the Henderson sale had taken place a decade earlier, but the atmosphere could not have been more different. There was no festive chatter, no good-natured ribbing. People stood in small, quiet groups, their hands in their pockets, their faces grim. They were watching a neighbor's life be dismantled, and they knew it could just as easily be their own. It was a funeral for a farm. Rich was there, but he was a shadow of the man I had known. His new Carhartt jacket had been replaced by a thin, worn coat. He looked thin, gaunt, his eyes hollowed out. He stood near the back of the crowd, not speaking to anyone, just watching as the auctioneer sold off his tools, his livestock, his family's history, one lot at a time. I stood there for a while, a profound sadness settling over me. There was no victory in this, no satisfaction. I saw my own reflection in his fate. But for a few different choices, but for the lessons my father had drilled into me, that could have been me standing there, watching my world be sold to the lowest bidder. The auction of his personal property finished. Then the man from the bank, a grim-faced stranger in a city suit, stepped up with the auctioneer. "All right, folks," the auctioneer's voice boomed, unnaturally loud in the somber silence. "We will now offer the real estate." 160 acres, more or less, with house, barn and outbuildings. A prime piece of ground. What am I bid? The crowd was silent. No one wanted to be the first to pick over the bones of a neighbor's farm. The price of land had collapsed. It was worth less than half of what it had been just a few years before. The banker looked nervous. He needed to recover something for the bank. "Let's start the bidding at $500 an acre," the auctioneer pleaded. "That's a steal, folks. 500 an acre." Still silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the barn. I saw Rich flinch, as if he'd been struck. $500 an acre for the land his family had bled for. It was an insult. I thought about the money I had in the bank, the profits from the good years sitting there safe. I thought about my father's words, "Debt is a chain." And I thought about how this man, for all his arrogance, had been a neighbor. His children had gone to school with my David. His wife and Martha were in the same church group. I stepped forward. The crowd parted slightly, their eyes on me. I looked at the auctioneer. $600 an acre, I said, my voice clear and steady. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The banker's head snapped up. Rich Peterson looked at me, his hollow eyes wide with disbelief. He thought I was there to gloat, to deliver the final killing blow. Another farmer, emboldened, bid $625. $700, I said immediately. The bidding went back and forth, but my opponent was hesitant. I was not. I knew exactly how much I could spend, and I knew it was more than anyone else there was willing to risk. My bids were firm, immediate, leaving no room for doubt. Finally, at $850 an acre, the other bidder fell silent and shook his head. $850 once, the auctioneer called out, his eyes scanning the crowd. $850 twice. Sold for $136,000 to Frank Miller. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot. A murmur went through the crowd. Frank Miller, the old-fashioned fool, the man with the rusty tractor, now owned the Peterson homestead. I walked to the clerk's table and wrote out a check, drawn on an account that could cover it 3 times over. As the crowd dispersed, I saw Rich still standing by the barn, looking lost. He was staring at the house his grandfather had built, the home he was about to be evicted from. I walked over to him. He didn't look at me. He just stared at the peeling paint on the side of the barn. "I suppose you're happy now, Miller," he said, his voice a ragged whisper. "You got what you wanted. You get to be king of the hill." "That's not why I did it, Rich," I said quietly. He finally turned to look at me, his face a mask of confusion and defeat. "Then why?" "To rub my nose in it." "I need help," I said. "I've got my land, and now I've got this place. It's too much for me and David to handle on our own. I need a good man, someone who knows this ground better than anyone. Someone who knows every wet spot, every clay knob. I'll pay you a fair wage. You and your family can stay in the house. You can work this land. Your land." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He was searching my face for mockery, for pity, for the punchline to some cruel joke. He found none. He saw only a simple, honest offer. The fight went out of him. His shoulders, which had been rigid with anger and shame, slumped. His eyes welled up with tears, and for the first time he looked not like a rival, but like a man who had lost everything. He wiped his eyes with the back of his rough hand and took a shaky breath. "Why, Frank?" he asked, his voice cracking. "After everything, all the things I said about you, about that tractor." I looked over toward my own farm, where the top of the big Bud's red cab was visible over the hill. "Because we're neighbors, Rich, and because nobody should have to watch their home be sold out from under them. The bank beat you, not me. Now do you want the job or not?" He nodded slowly, unable to speak. We stood there for a moment in the cold March wind, 2 farmers bound not by friendship, but by the unforgiving soil and a shared understanding of just how quickly a man's fortune could turn. The years that followed were healing years. The farm economy slowly recovered, but it was a different world. The wild optimism of the 70s was gone, replaced by a hard-won caution. The phrase cash flow became more important than yield. And the farmers who survived were the ones who, like me, had kept their debt in check. Rich became a good hand. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet competence. He worked his old home place with a care and dedication that I could never have matched. There was a silent respect between us. We didn't talk much about the past. We didn't need to. The proof of our different philosophies was all around us. In the paid-for land we worked, and in the sold signs that still littered the county roads on the farms of men who had gambled and lost. My son David came back to the farm after college. He had a head for business, but a heart for the land. I taught him everything I knew, not just about planting depths and fertilizer rates, but about the dangers of a banker's smile and the true meaning of an asset. One Saturday in the late 80s, I found him in the workshop, staring at the Independence. It was still our main tillage tractor. Its red paint was faded and chipped, its massive tires worn smooth, but the Cummins engine still fired up with the same deep-throated rumble. "You know, Dad," David said, running a hand over the thick steel of the fender, "I was running the numbers. For what a new tractor with this kind of horsepower costs, we could run this old girl for another 30 years. Even with a complete engine rebuild every decade, the cost is a fraction." "It's not about the money, son," I told him, leaning against a front tire that was as tall as my chest. "It's about what the money represents. This tractor, it represents being your own man. Every bolt you tighten yourself, every gallon of fuel you pay for with cash, every acre you turn over without sending a check to a bank in some far-off city. That's freedom. Never let a man in a suit own your sweat. That's the most valuable thing you'll ever have." He nodded, understanding. He had seen the wreckage of the farm crisis. He had seen his friends' parents lose their homes. The lesson was more real to him than any textbook. Now I'm an old man. My hands are gnarled and stiff. I let David and Rich do most of the heavy work. But sometimes, in the spring, when the air is cool and the earth smells rich and full of promise, I'll climb up into the cab of that old big bud. The seat is cracked and the cab is loud. But when I turn that key and feel that big Cummins rumble to life beneath me, it's like shaking hands with an old friend. I'll pull the tractor out into the field, the setting sun glinting off the worn red hood. I'll drop the big chisel plow into the ground, push the throttle forward, and feel the raw, honest power surging through the steel. Out across the road, I can see the lights come on in the Peterson house. In my own house, Martha is cooking supper. The land, all of it, is mine. Not the bank's, mine. Rich Peterson built an empire of credit and paper, and it was swept away like dust in the wind. I took a $1,000 piece of scrap, a forgotten giant everyone laughed at, and I built a different kind of empire. An empire of independence, an empire of self-reliance, an old iron empire the bank could never touch. And as the deep thrum of the engine echoes across the quiet fields at twilight, I know my father would be proud.